on yesterday's podcast, we talked about the negative effects of helicopter parenting on child emotional development. And in that podcast, you mentioned the spectrum from neglect and sort of ignoring on one end of the spectrum, and helicopter parenting, over-controlling, overly emotionally involved on the other end.
Right.
Today we're going to talk about another form of over-controlling parenting, and that is something akin to authoritarian parenting, and that is over-controlling, but with a, as it says in the article, a harshness that you don't see in helicopter parenting, but it's an over-controlling, you're going to do what I say because I said so, because I'm the adult. So it's over-controlling in a different way.
Right. And what the researchers were studying here is the whole question of where does aggressive and what is called callous dash unemotional, CU, callous unemotional traits. Where do aggressive and callous unemotional traits, how do they emerge? Right. And for a long time, we've known that you can inherit some of these things, or you have brain chemistry or structural anomalies that create aggression and callous emotional traits. We're talking about sociopaths. The classic would be kids who kill animals and set fires when they're young, and then they're antisocial, they're angry and aggressive, and the harsh bullying and that sort of. Why do some children develop these traits? Okay, and for a long time we thought it was mainly due to either genetics or biology. And so what these researchers wanted to do was to see if there might be some environmental factors that also lead to aggressive and callous traits later on in life. And so that was the essential question they were studying. I mean, we know from the animal research that even rats and mice and other mammals, if they're stressed and the parents don't nurture them and take care of them, and that they will develop aggression as teenagers. Okay? And so, so these researchers wanted to study parenting effects on the later development of aggression and callous unemotional traits in their offspring.
Right, and so they followed, and this is an article out of the University of Pennsylvania. The link is in the show notes, but it's talking about research done there at University of Pennsylvania, along with University of Michigan.
It was Michigan or Michigan State? I think it was
University of Michigan.
Oh, Michigan.
And both University of Michigan and Michigan State.
And Michigan State and the University of Pennsylvania. So, so the what they took from one of the universities was there's a twin study there. Okay, and the reason twins are important in this study is that if you use identical twins, you're controlling for the biology, the genetic factor. Okay, so you're talking about identical twins who have exactly the same, or essentially the same, genetic and biological makeup. And so what they wanted to do was to see if the twins were treated differently by their parents, would one twin show more aggression and unemotional traits later on. Okay, so that the twins, the identical twins, controlled for the biology variables.
Yeah, and again, this is one of those cases where they just designed the study very nicely. To look at some of the differences between the way the parents treated and dealt with, managed the twins individually. And they looked at several traits from the parents, but also from about the kids as the kids were getting older. And they did find that parents who are more, again, harsh, sort of on that authoritarian end of the parenting spectrum, that the kids tend to exhibit more of these callous behaviors.
That's right. They gave, there were two major things that they measured. One was warmth versus harshness. Okay, so they asked, they had 24 statements that they gave the parents that would measure harshness versus warmth
Right.
in the way they parented. And the second was they wanted to look at 35 traits that the children
Right.
displayed.
Related to aggression,
Right.
and callous behaviors.
Which measured the aggressive and callous unemotional traits. So they did these 2 questionnaires and then compared them. So what they wanted to do essentially was to see if parents treated one twin differently than the other twin. So these are probably subtle differences. They're not major differences, okay? Because most parents would tend to treat the twins similarly.
Pretty similar, yeah.
But what they were looking for were just small differences in the way parents treated each twin to see if the outcome would be different.
Right. Yeah.
And lo and behold.
Yeah. And again, so when they found that if one of the twins was treated more harshly, then that child was more likely to exhibit some of those aggressive, callous types of traits.
Right. Now, and the other reason that these researchers wanted to study environmental variables like parenting was we can't control biology, but we can control environmental variables. And so what they wanted to do was, if they could establish a link between parenting style and later aggressive behavior, that maybe if we could change the parents' behavior, we could reduce the likelihood of later aggressive behavior, which is the good part of this study. What fascinated me, I mean, when we think of harsh parenting, we think of parents who are, the typical rough parent, slapping and hitting and spankings and paddlings and harsh, denial of food and that sort of physical and emotional and verbal abuse. Okay. But and obviously that's bad for any kid.
Right.
I mean, when you start hitting children, I mean, there have been plenty of studies done that kind of violent or harsh parenting leads to bad behaviors later in life.
Yeah.
Well, I got to thinking about it, and if you look at it from the child's point of view, what does the child consider harsh parenting?
Right.
I might consider this, you'll often hear parents say, oh, you should have seen my parents. If you think this is bad, you should have seen what my dad would have knocked my teeth out. My mother would have slapped me, And you hear today's parents talk about the way they were parented. It doesn't matter what you think as a parent. You might think that this is
justified,
gentle,
not
very harsh parenting. But we have to look at it from the child's perspective. And I got to thinking about this phone, but take her cell phone, okay? Yeah. We think that's nothing. I mean, as a parent, you can live without your cell phone for a week. You can live without your cell phone for a month. I'll turn it off, okay? There are children who probably consider that really harsh.
I have people that I've talked to, teenagers that I've talked to, who would rather corporal punishment than have their phone taken away.
Spank me, paddle me, don't take my phone.
Right.
Okay. So if your children might consider that harsh parenting, and if you do that over and over and over again, I mean, I see plenty of families where kids have been punished severely, and those kids are getting angry.
Right.
I mean, the parents don't think it's so harsh, but the child thinks it's excessive and harsh.
Right.
And I'm wondering if it's the child's perception more than the parent's actual behavior that is the problem.
Right.
Because if your child thinks that taking her phone, what if your child goes to school the next day? My parents say, "Oh my God, my parents would never do that. That's so cruel. That's so."
Yeah.
And the kid thinks it's harsh.
Right.
And they're going to react.
Right.
Okay. So I don't know. I have no idea whether that's true or not. But it made me wonder if the kid thinks it's harsh. If the child thinks it's harsh.
That would be an interesting follow-up to the study to assess the child's perspective of the parenting to determine if they considered it harsh or not, and then follow up with the.
And conversely, I have children come in who say, "Oh yeah, I got that," and I think, "Wow, that's pretty." I'm thinking, don't say it, but wow, that's pretty harsh. The child doesn't think much of it. Say, "No, it's not bad. It's okay. I deserved it." And I'm thinking, wow,
Yeah.
I would have, you know. So I think the child's perspective here is important. And I think as a parent, you have to be careful about what your children might think is, might consider harsh parenting.
Right.
And that's an environmental variable, because if they run around with kids who never see harsh parenting, then a little bit of harsh parenting might go a very long way.
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely. And they mentioned in here that some of the follow-up that they're going to do is to see, you know, once we have some of this information, what can we do about it? How can we reduce the risk of some of these long-term effects?
Right. Because the appearance of aggressive and callous, unemotional traits usually appears in the preteen and especially the teenage years. Okay, and for kids who have been dealt with harshly, they're at much greater risk for developing those traits as teenagers. They become pretty aggressive and sometimes violent as teenagers. It'll probably settle down later in life, but we need to be careful. One of the horrific, chilling stories is about Iceman. Kuklinski was his last name, and he was a serial killer. I mean, he was very, very aggressive, horribly aggressive, and the forensic psychiatrist interviewed him in prison, and he talked not nonchalantly, but very matter-of-factly about all the people he killed and the way he killed them. And he begins by talking about how he was treated as a youngster and how both parents physically abused him, and it just turned him completely around. So I think that's an extreme example, but something that all of us should think about.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I thought about was, we get these kids in school who are aggressive and unemotional, and they tend to get punished and dealt with harshly at school. You know, suspended and expelled and punished for being aggressive. But remember, they're the product of violence and harsh behavior at home, and they come to school and they get more of it. And so again, you sort of trigger that, the very trait you're trying to get rid of, you sort of trigger it and make it worse. So
absolutely.
Lots of stuff to think about here in this one.
And lots of many more studies that need to be done to look at all of this. So. All right, that's it. All right, that's all for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.